Live from Riga in Latvia, and these are the headlines. In a major shift in security policy, Finland's top leadership says the country should apply for NATO membership without delay. North Korea has fired 3 ballistic missiles, according to Seoul's military. This hours after Pyongyang announced the country's first ever case of COVID-19 and a lockdown. Britain's economy grew at a slower pace in the first quarter compared with the final 3 months of last year as the country battles soaring inflation. Many Sri Lankans flee Colombo to return to their hometowns during a brief relaxation in curfew as the island nation faces its worst ever economic crisis. After Beijing reports 24 new COVID cases, China shuts its Palace Museum as stringent curbs are used to battle a COVID outbreak. The President and Prime Minister of Finland have announced that the country should apply to join the NATO military alliance without delay. The Finnish government is likely to formally apply for membership after receiving parliamentary approval next week. Finland shares a 1,300-kilometre border with Russia, and public support for joining NATO surged after the invasion of Ukraine. Finland's neighbour to the west, Sweden, is also expected to announce its intentions to join NATO over the weekend. The accession process is expected to be shorter than previous applications from other countries. The 30-nation alliance will grant observer status to Finland and Sweden for the interim period, but the formal ratification can take anywhere between 4 months to a year. Our correspondent Rosie Burchard is joining me live now from Brussels, where NATO is headquartered. And Rosie, explain what happens next.
Well, what happens next, Ollie, is a major shift in the European security landscape. Let's just take a look back. NATO was born in the aftermath of World War II. It had a mission to provide collective security for Western Europe and North America against the Soviet Union. But in all that time, all those decades in between, Finland has always kept its distance. It was happy to be a partner, but not a member, and it's been keeping up business-like cooperation with its neighbour Moscow. But the invasion of Ukraine has really changed all of that. As you rightly said, public support for NATO membership has surged, and now the country's leaders are expressing their intention to join. This is not the final step. It paves the way for that accession and reverses decades of military non-alignment. Finland is expected to submit a formal application in the coming days, and Sweden will likely follow suit. They're expected to submit those applications together. This is something which Moscow will certainly not be happy about.
And Rosie, when we talk about reaction, where I am, for example, in Latvia, we've just heard from the Latvian Prime Minister, Krišjānis Kariņš. He says he sincerely welcomes the announcement regarding Finland's application for NATO membership. He calls it an important turn towards an even stronger alliance and greater security, he says, in the Baltic Sea region. What about NATO and what about Russia? What are we hearing from them?
Well, quite different reactions there from NATO and Russia. As you pointed out. We've had some NATO leaders coming in with clear expressions of support. Another one is the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. She says her country will do everything to move this forward without delay. Both countries, Sweden and Finland, if they want to join, will need formal backing from all NATO allies, but no opposition is expected. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has in the past even said that the alliance is expected to welcome Finland and Sweden with open arms. Russia, on the other hand, says NATO is a threat to its security, and it says this move from Finland's leaders is also a threat. It says that joining NATO will not improve security for Finland. And more broadly, Moscow has in the past threatened to deploy extra nuclear weapons and more military assets in the Baltic Sea region. It says to rebalance the situation if Finland joins. But once Finland is part of NATO, if indeed it does proceed with the application as is very much expected, it will be party to Article 5. That's the collective defence pledge taken by all NATO allies, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. And that means it can count on support from big military powers like the United States. Now, while there are concerns that perhaps in this interim period between application and formal accession, Finland could be subject to some retaliation from Moscow, perhaps in the form of cyber attacks, certainly what I'm hearing from diplomats here is that they believe there's no real imminent military threat to Finland, not least because Russia very much has its hands tied in Ukraine, where that war rages on.
Okay, Rosie, thank you. To Norway next, which is NATO's northernmost flank. It shares land and maritime borders with Russia. The border town of Kirkenes has long been pointed to as a symbol of cross-border harmony in the Arctic, but people there are now adapting to a new reality.
This is Kirkenes, a small Norwegian town 15 minutes drive from Russia. For 3 decades, it has been a symbol of cross-border harmony in the Arctic. Then, Russia invaded Ukraine in February, and since then, its residents have been forced to face a new reality. The local mayor, Lina Norrenbergen.
Our community consists of many Russians and also Ukrainians, so of course it's been tough for many. We have lived in peace for many years, and now our neighbour is going to war with one of its neighbours. Of course it has affected us all.
Home to 3,500 people, of which 400 are Russian and 30 Ukrainian, Kirkenes has had bilingual street signs for decades, and residents have been able to travel visa-free to Russia. But the invasion has forced tough decisions, namely with companies seeking to reduce their dependence on Russian business.
When the invasion happened in February, I think we had a whole registry of feelings. Many felt grief, anger, frustration. It has been a surreal time since then. Nobody thought this could really happen.
While non-EU Norway has applied most international sanctions, it has not shut its ports to Russian fishing vessels, a lifeline for the ports of Arctic Norway. Despite this, at the Kimek shipyard, CEO Gregor Mansverk is worried about restructuring without losing any employees.
I'm not planning for a future without the Russian vessels, but I'm planning for the future where the Russian clients are not the major ones. That is important. So I still hope that the turnover from the Russian side will be the same, but the percentage, that's today 70%, should be maybe 20%.
Norwegian Prime Minister Johan Gahr Støre is hopeful cross-border cooperation will resume in full before long.
Well, I still see Kirkenes in that light, because the people who live here are now receiving refugees. There are Russian school kids who come here and have moved to Kirkenes. So, there will be a day after at some stage, I don't know when. And I think the spirit of the people living in this municipality is that, borders should be respected, but there should also be contact.
But for now, the Arctic town in NATO's Norway is freezing ties with its eastern neighbour.
In Ukraine, in the occupied city of Kherson, A new currency's been introduced and media and internet services have been brought in as Moscow aims to assert control there. Russia appears to be trying to establish a land bridge from Kherson to Crimea. Meanwhile, in the occupied city of Mariupol, workers have been clearing rubble and chopping wood for local citizens and providing them with water. Local authorities say around 150,000 people are still living in that city. The iron and steel works factory is the only area in Mariupol that remains outside the control of Russian forces. Photos released by the Azov regiment show the state of the Ukrainian forces inside the steel plant. Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv continues to resist Russian attacks. Ukrainian forces are continuing a counterattack to the north and have recaptured several towns and villages towards the Russian border. The residents of one village have returned to assess the impact.
But there is little else left.
I have not expected anything like this. Such aggression, such destruction. I came and I kissed the ground. I simply kissed it. My home, there is nothing. Where am I to live? How am I to live?
Ukrainian military reported new gains on Wednesday that signaled a possible shift in the course of the war. The advance appears to be the fastest that Ukraine has mounted since it drove Russian troops away from Kyiv and out of the country's north at the beginning of April. If sustained, Ukrainian forces could be posed to threaten Russian supply lines. Aerial footage released by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry purports to show a missile obliterating a Russian T-95 tank. In southern Ukraine, a different picture. Russian forces continued to bombard the Azovstal steelworks in the port of Mariupol, the last bastion of Ukrainian defenders in a city now almost completely controlled by Russia after more than 2 months of siege. Ukraine's Azov regiment, holed up inside, said Russia was bombing and trying to storm it. Kiev said it is likely that tens of thousands of people have been killed in Mariupol. Ukrainian authorities say between 150,000 and 170,000 of the city's 400,000 residents are still living there amid the Russian-occupied ruins.
The UK economy contracted by 0.1% in March, according to the latest data. Analysts are warning the economy could be heading for a recession, and the Bank of England has already pointed to an expected sharp economic slowdown this year. Prices are rising at their fastest rate in 3 decades, driven by soaring fuel, food and energy costs. Although the economy contracted in March, GDP grew by 0.8% overall in the first 3 months of the year. Now the government is under growing pressure to provide more support to households for tackling soaring bills.
And because what we're confronting are global inflationary forces, unfortunately, I can't make them all disappear. But where we can make a difference, of course we are, which is why we're investing billions of pounds to support both families and businesses through the challenging months ahead.
There's a growing outcry over the death of the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot dead while reporting in the occupied West Bank. Scuffles have broken out between Palestinian protesters and Israeli police in Jerusalem. Protesters have been on the streets of Jerusalem and across Tunisia, Jordan, Iraq and Lebanon, all condemning the death of the reporter. The European Union, United States, the Palestinians and the Human Rights Council at the UN have all demanded an independent and transparent investigation.
the Arab group in New York adopted a statement condemning in the strongest possible term this criminal act by the Israeli occupying authorities and demanding an international independent investigation on this crime and to take those who are responsible for this crime to face the accountability regarding these crimes.
Israel blames Palestinian gunmen for the killing, but journalists who were at the scene of the incident insist there were no Palestinian fighters nearby. Our correspondent Jody Cohen has sent us this report.
I'm in the beautiful and tranquil Haifa, where 200 Arab Israelis took to the streets on Thursday evening, waving Palestinian flags to protest the shooting of veteran journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Everyone agrees that her death during a firefight between Israeli soldiers and Palestinians in Jenin is a tragedy, as are the deaths of all journalists caught in the crossfire while reporting from conflict zones across the world. What Israelis and Palestinians don't agree on is how this happened. An initial Israeli probe is said to have found that Israeli troops did not fire at Abu Akleh, and the Palestinian Authority has now refused Israel's request for a joint investigation to find the answers. The PA says they will do an independent probe and release their findings. Meanwhile, President Abbas has already accused Israel of not only being responsible for the shooting, but of shooting her intentionally. Israel's leaders have reaffirmed the importance of a free media in Israel, as in all democracies. The concern is now that the accusations of murder will lead to possible revenge attacks. This is Jody Cohen for WION. World is One.
Masafa Yatta in the southern West Bank is fully under Israeli control and is home to several small Palestinian villages. Last week, an Israeli court repurposed this region for Israeli military use, ending a 2 decades-long legal battle. Now, around 1,000 residents there are living in fear of eviction.
This is Masafer Yatta, an Israeli-occupied territory south of Hebron, home to several small Palestinian villages. This entire land of about 3,000 hectares has been repurposed for Israeli military use. And about 1,000 Palestinian villagers now live in the fear of eviction any time.
Today I fear for my future and the future of my children. As I have no alternative, this is my land. If I leave, where would I go? I can't afford leaving, and this is my land and I can't leave it. Also, what shall I do with my sheep? I can't take them to any other place. This is my land and I can't get out. The Israelis are crazy. We would die for our land and not leave it.
In the 1980s, Israel designated this village as a firing zone. Firing zones are used for military exercises, and the presence of civilians is prohibited. The villagers living, farming and raising animals do not hold permanent residency since 2 decades.
The Israelis built settlements here. A settlement was only built 10 years ago. It's an outpost that they are instilling by building houses, providing them with electricity and water, and Israeli soldiers guarding them. On the other hand, this has always been my land, and now they want to evict me.
After a 2 decades-long legal battle, the Israeli High Court has ruled in favor of the state and concluded that the community could not prove they were permanent residents before the 1980s. Despite expert testimony and literature presented in court, the literature piece showed that the area has been inhabited for decades.
The occupation policy will be painful for the residents of Masafer Yatta. It will affect their livelihood. Their crops will be destroyed by the army equipment during the training here. The residents might lose their machinery like tractors and cars, since the occupation force had already confiscated them in the past and can reiterate these practices. It can even proceed with blocking roads.
Since the judge's decision was unanimous, It is not clear whether any further legal channels are available for the residents. The Palestinian communities living within firing zones have been repeatedly threatened, with home demolitions and confiscation of agricultural land because they lack building permits. Permits which are issued by the Israeli authorities and are nearly impossible to obtain.
Our message to the international community is that what the occupation is doing in this area goes against international humanitarian law and against human rights. The International Criminal Court and the United Nations must take an action to stop these crimes against the area of Masafer Yatta.
While the ruling did not order evictions, Israel can forcibly expel the Palestinians at any time.
Authorities in Hong Kong have accused 4 people, along with a cardinal and a Cantonese pop singer, of colluding with foreign powers. All 4 of them were arrested, questioned for hours and then released. All were trustees of a now disbanded fund which helped Hong Kong detainees 3 years ago. The cardinal's arrest has prompted condemnation from the United States and the Vatican. Joseph Zen is a former bishop of Hong Kong and one of the most senior Catholic clerics in the city. He's been an advocate for Hong Kong's democracy movement. The singer, Denise Ho, is a popular local vocalist and an outspoken advocate for LGBTQ rights. Our correspondent Richard Kimber reports.
These arrests come in relation to this fund that was set up at the height of the anti-government protest movement in 2019. This fund, called the Humanitarian Relief Fund, was specifically an effort to try and raise money for protesters, many of whom were young, some teenagers and students who were facing prosecution and heavy legal bills as a result of being arrested during those protests. A lot of money was raised in a short space of time to help those protesters, not just with financial aid towards their legal bills, but also towards medical bills, as some had become injured during clashes with police. Now, the trustees of that fund included, of course, Cardinal Joseph Zen, the most senior Catholic Church figure in Hong Kong, and Denise Ho, as you mentioned, a well-known Cantonese pop singer, also high-profile barristers in Hong Kong, and one former lawmaker who's actually already in jail on other protest charges. So high-profile figures made an effort to try and promote this fund and set it up. And Cardinal Joseph Zen, the 90-year-old Catholic Church leader here, was really the face of that campaign. He was the face and voice of campaign videos calling for fundraising, and police really want to get to the bottom of where all this money was coming from. Specifically, they want to investigate whether or not some of it was coming from overseas, and if so, whether or not some of that money was potentially coming from state-sanctioned bodies overseas in an effort to undermine what authorities here see as Hong Kong's authority over its own territory.
And finally today, a look at cybersecurity and online password best practice. I'll log out while you take a look at that. See you from Riga at the same time tomorrow.
We often tell you to set up complex passwords for your online accounts. We keep warning you about the dangers of reusing the same login credentials for all your online accounts. And today we're going to go a step further and help you understand how your passwords can be attacked if you do not stay vigilant. One of the most common techniques is brute force attack. This password attack is essentially a guessing game where the hacker tries different password combinations using hacking software until they're able to crack the code. The best solution to avoid such instances is by creating a unique password for every online account. Credential stuffing is a type of cyber attack in which the attacker collects stolen account credentials to break into your online accounts and profiles. They use spyware and other kinds of malware to get the credentials they want. Also, the dark web often has lists of compromised passwords for cyber criminals to use for their devious plans. Hackers may use these lists to carry out their plans and exploit your data. Here's an easy solution. You can enable two-factor authentication for online accounts and avoid any suspicious login attempts. is a manipulation technique. In this type of attack, password hackers create websites that look like legitimate login pages. Cybercriminals trick you into using fake login pages and record the information you type in. This gives cybercriminals exactly what they want. We suggest that you avoid clicking on suspicious links or attachments and always look for legitimate pages. One way that hackers get their hands on passwords is by looking over people's shoulders in public as they type. You can avoid such situations by enabling biometric features like facial recognition to sign into accounts on mobile devices. Miscreants have numerous unfair ways to hack your passwords in online accounts. Therefore, it is important that you also adopt various best practices to keep your account secure. Having a strong password is a must, as it's the first line of defense on the internet. But that's not enough. Enable multi-factor authentication and biometric authentication and always use a password manager. Be alert and stay safe.
There are many other. This is right, Arab.